Canadian director-writer Brandon Cronenberg continues to captivate and shock audiences with his mind-bending sci-fi horror films, Antiviral, Possessor, and now Infinity Pool. We sat down for a chat where he shared his creative process, what he thinks of audience interpretations, if horror's a dirty word, and of course, Mia Goth. Hi Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I am such a big fan. I know a lot of your films deal with the idea of self-identity, and I know you touched on Imposter Syndrome, sparking the idea for Possessor. Was there something similar that happened with Infinity Pool?
To be honest, it was less personal with Infinity Pool. I mean, there are personal elements in the film. You know, I was going through this 8-year gap between my first and second films, and so there are elements, although James isn't a stand-in for me, there are elements of his character which are kind of self-mockery, you know, given my own writer's block and failure to get everywhere and anywhere in those 8 years, you know, there are aspects of his character that are kind of a joke about myself or making fun of my own insecurities. But the central idea for the film actually came from a short story that I was writing in 2014, I think, or 2013. So it was just the first execution scene, and so it was more ideas that I was kind of exploring to do with identity, personal identity, philosophy, and you know, punishment and that kind of thing. The other stuff grew out of that initial scene, basically.
Infinity Pool not only deals with the idea of existential dread, but also class and politics. How do you plan a film, and what's your process for planning a film with so many moving parts and complex characters and themes?
It's, you know, I kind of have fallen into the sort of normal, boring 3-act structure sketch that film, you know, I'll map things out in that kind of traditional 3-act way to just sort of start with a structure that kind of would make sense in a conventional film way. That's just sort of the plot, and then I'll have you know, a notebook full of ideas and things that I want to explore that I can kind of hang off it. And so some of that will get woven through the script because it's essential to the story. Other aspects of it are just, you know, some idea I had, you know, on the subway or whatever that I want to fit into something, and then that might spark a thread in the narrative that kind of grows out of that.
How do you plan these experimental visuals within your films? And how do you align what kind of look is going to go with what story? Because you have such particular, even just like the colors, the grading is so different for each of your films. So how do you find that kind of feel and mood?
It's a long process. I mean, it'll start with Kareem Hussein, usually my cinematographer. We'll spend a fair amount of time going through the script before we shoot, doing a kind of theoretical shot list, before we have actors, before we have locations, before we have anything real. And that just helps us figure out a kind of visual language for the film. For instance, in Possessor, okay, we had scenes where the protagonist is in another body, sort of plugged into this machine, and scenes where she's outside of the body, and we wanted to subtly distinguish those two worlds. So one of them is handheld, the other one's not handheld. One of them has slightly deeper focal depth than the other, that kind of thing. For the hallucination sequences, we'll really just spend a lot of time in Kareem's living room messing with weird pieces of glass and gels and projection feedback and all this stuff to try to just stumble onto these visual ideas, which we can then experiment with in the context of the film. We'll kind of create a bank of ideas that we're excited about. Eventually we'll bring in Dan Martin, the makeup effects artist who's done my last 2 films, and he'll have some ideas. We'll be brainstorming the sort of makeup effects front, and he'll often have something he's just been desperate to try and he hasn't had a chance to, and it ends up being brilliant. We shoot all this stuff, we re-photograph a lot of the footage through other glass and gels. Like, we'll shoot a bunch of the film, go back to Kareem's living room and project onto his wall this sort of hours and hours of rushes that we'll re-photograph through weird lenses and gels and with flares and so on. That creates this mountain of footage which then goes into the editing room. It's a very experimental process that we sort of find as we go. In the script, there'll usually be this one paragraph that just says, images pulse, it's a weird nightmare of whatever. And that's kind of coped by team to say, you know, we're going to spend hours and hours and hours just sort of like having, honestly, a lot of fun and just playing with this stuff and figuring out.
First day is always difficult. It's like a new skin working itself into place.
How did Mia Goth get involved with Infinity Pool? Because her cast as Gabby is just so perfect, and I'm so glad you let her keep her accent as well, because people don't usually do that for her. Did you write it with her in mind? She's so perfect for the role.
No, I mean, so I never write with actors in mind because the stars kind of have to align to get any one actor. You know, they have to be available, they have to want to do it. So to avoid heartbreak, I don't write for particular actors. What I do is I just have I have actors who I kind of have been obsessing over for years. I mean, Mia, you know, starting with Nymphomaniac and all throughout her career. I mean, I've thought she's just one of those actors who sears through the screen every time you see her. It's just so compelling. It's so, you know, she's so fascinating. She never does anything boring. She's, you know, steals every scene she's in. So I'd wanted to work with her for years. What I want to do is take someone like that and let them inject a new life into the characters, because by the time I'm making the film, the characters have kind of gone to sleep on me. I've been working on the script for so many years. And so with someone like Mia, she's so brilliant. I just want to give her a certain amount of freedom to find the character, explore the character, and inject her art into the film. And so it ends up feeling like you couldn't have possibly had anyone else play that role, but it's because she's made it her own, you know, and because she's so great.
She's fantastic. I've watched the film a couple of times, and every time I can't pinpoint each transition in her character, how she's like letting the wall down even more and more. She does it so gradually. It's fantastic. There's a huge conversation right now with what is horror and what's not horror. I don't know if you've heard of any of this online. A lot of gatekeeping for this. With a lot of new directors bending the horror genre. How do you feel about, because I think that you still categorize your films as horror, where a lot of people find that as like a dirty word in a weird way. What does horror mean to you, and how do you feel about genre bending, I guess?
Right. I mean, I certainly don't think horror is a dirty word. I mean, that's a very weird and very kind of North American thing, I think, this idea that genre is somehow lesser, or actually there was some there was a guy I knew from Eastern Europe, actually, who said he had a film festival and he would categorize films as either film or genre, and that was, you know, it's this very sort of disparaging take on genre. That's an old problem, but it's obviously ridiculous. I mean, anyone who cares about horror knows how artful and how broad that category is. So I absolutely think my films are horror films. I don't even really think that these films that are classified as genre bending are really bending the genre. I think it's just that, you know, there's a kind of mainstream conception of horror, and that is sort of the Conjuring series, and that, you know, that's not to knock the Conjuring series. It's just, you know, it's a lot of jump scares, it's a certain type of fear. It's like Scream, and it's a certain type of mainstream slasher film. That's the mainstream conception of horror. But when you actually get into the history of horror filmmaking, it's a way more expansive category than that. You know, it's very hard to define. I think any genre of film is sort of imperfect. You can't really lock down exactly, you know, what is a horror film, what is science fiction, what is a thriller, what is the difference between a horror film and a thriller. You know, the answer is, there's no answer exactly. It's all a little bit vague at a certain point. But I think, you know, in the most general sense, horror is dealing with certain aspects of human emotion, actively engaging with certain emotions and experiences that we would normally avoid, like dread, revulsion, fear, and exploring those aspects of the human psyche. That could also apply to certain other films that we would normally consider outside the horror genre, for sure. But I think it's a pretty broad category, and I sort of don't understand what that discussion is, really.
I completely agree. There's a term called elevated horror. I'm sure you probably heard of that.
Absolutely.
That gets thrown around a lot. Instead of just saying something's horror, people are so scared to, I guess they think if they say that they like horror movies, it means Conjuring.
No, totally. And I think it's a marketing thing too, right? I mean, if a company says this is horror and then it's whatever, it's Infinity Pool and not The Conjuring, it could confuse a mainstream audience. Whereas if you say this is specialty horror or it's elevated horror or whatever, I think it's partly to position expectations. But it doesn't really have anything to do with the genre in a kind of, film theory way.
In saying that, I'm going to subcategorize you. What keeps you within like the body horror subgenre with horror?
I'm not really trying to work in any particular category. I mean, I'm happy to be categorized as a horror filmmaker. I don't think it's a dirty word, but I have certain creative impulses and I follow them and they lead me somewhere, and that's kind of how I come up with my films. And so whatever I'm doing now, whatever you want to call it, is just kind of where my head is at, rather than a conscious effort to work within a particular genre.
Men are trained by women like M to see themselves as weak. It can take some work to undo.
Regarding the idea of identity that we kind of touched on earlier, how do you feel about people interpreting your films differently based on their personal perspectives and identities? I've heard this a lot with Possessor, a lot of people claiming it means something very personal to them, and I'd love to hear, just from a director point of view, how you feel about that.
I think it's great. Experiencing a film is incredibly personal and it's incredibly subjective. The last creative act when you make any film, I think, is done by the audience, because you can set all of this up, but really it becomes something different to everyone who watches it. And for people to have personal experiences, personal connections to my films, I mean, that's incredible. I love that. And also for people to disagree and to interpret my films differently. I mean, I have my own interpretations as I'm making the films. I know what happens from my perspective, but very often I try to leave some things a little vague or create these kind of opaque moments that allow for disagreement, allow for various interpretations, because those are the kinds of films that I like. I like films where there's a discussion to be had about what happened. I like to explore films that way, and so I want to make films that kind of also allow for those experiences.
One last question. I've heard you say in an interview once that you aim to confuse, which I thought was so funny. What emotion do you think is the most important for your audience to walk out of one of your films feeling?
I would love for people to have very different experiences coming out of my films. Again, part of that is structuring them so that there's a certain kind of open-endedness to them. There's some room to explore, and so that exploration is going to lead to hopefully fairly different experiences.
Thank you so much for your time today, Brandon. I absolutely love your movies and I love everything you're doing for horror right now. So I really appreciate it and I can't wait to see what's next for you.
Well, thank you so much. That's incredibly kind of you. Thanks.
That was amazing. I'm so glad that he answered and was so open about my questions about the horror genre and all of that. I'm so stoked that I got to ask him that, because I've always wondered that about his films, especially body horror. It doesn't sound like he's too attached to body horror. It just is where he goes, and he has such a distinct style with his visual representation and experimental moving parts within his films. So it's just really cool to see how it all comes together, and I think I have a better idea of who he is as a director from chatting with him. So that was a great experience. But even more exciting is Infinity Pool is coming to cinemas in Australia on May 11th. So I finally get to experience Infinity Pool on the big screen, which is where it was intended to be seen. So if you haven't seen it yet and you're thinking about it, I highly recommend it. It is an experience like none other, and Mia Goth is to die for. I'm so stoked to see what he does in the future. If you did enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps me out, and I'll talk to you all very soon. Stay safe and stay spooky. Bye, friends.